Hi everyone, my name is Jessica Swanson. I'm really looking forward to having the opportunity to discuss my thesis with you this afternoon, which was covering information warfare in the Russia-Ukraine and the Israel-Gaza war. So without further ado, I came into this project with one very vague overarching question, which was how do we mitigate the harms that come from information warfare? And naturally, this broke down into smaller sub-questions, the first of which was how has information warfare changed over time and what does it look like today? And the second question is, what legal international frameworks govern information warfare, and what gaps have emerged in them as a result of changes to the information environment? So information warfare is not a new phenomenon, but it is a relatively new term. It was first coined by the Department of Defense in 1993, and since then, several other states and academics have added their own twists. For the purposes of this presentation, though, there are three elements of information warfare that we really want to focus on. The first is that it utilizes a broad spectrum of capabilities. So it's not just propaganda, but kinetic attacks on telecommunications infrastructure or cyber attacks with informational effects. Secondly, they target both decision makers and the general public, typically one at a time, and the majority of them do target the public, with the intention being to have both a top-down and a bottom-up approach to shaping opinion and policy. And finally, even though we are examining it in the context of conflict, information warfare is not limited to conflict settings, and it appears to be an increasing fixture of peacetime, which is a bit concerning, perhaps. Anyways, so we will begin by examining various types of information warfare. There are a lot of different ways to think of it. I'm sure you are all very well acquainted with the term fake news. We will not be discussing that one. But the most commonly discussed term besides that is disinformation, which is a good starting point for us. So if we look at this Venn diagram here, we can see that there are three different types of information warfare that are differentiated based on two factors. So their facticity and their intent to deceive. And what we learn from these distinctions is that information warfare does not have to be false. So for example, if you think about taking a quote out of context and how that can completely reshape its meaning. And secondly, information warfare can be conducted unintentionally. So I'm sure everyone here has sent or posted or spread otherwise information and later realized it to be false. Even though we didn't intend to spread false information, that was the effect. But there are other ways of thinking about information operations. One is by tactic, if we think about the spectrum of capabilities that we discussed before. And the other is by objective, which I think is a bit more helpful, because it shows that the incentives behind information warfare are quite diverse. So it's not just a state trying to send a specific message, but also, for example, gaining information to guide strategic decision-making or to use as leverage, or targeting adversarial information technology to reduce their capabilities and then, of course, generate an advantage that way. So now looking into the case studies, I don't want to rehash all the information. Instead, I'd rather focus on the lessons. So to do that, I split them into two categories. The first being things that we already knew about information warfare but have been developed in this study. So beginning in that category, we start with the role of proximity. Previous research has demonstrated that individuals closer to a conflict are less likely to believe disinformation related to that conflict. But what we've learned from this study is that this theory really only holds true where the information environment is at least somewhat open. Next, quite similarly, it's demonstrated the degree to which domestic control over the information environment can shape a population's susceptibility to disinformation. So the more repressed an information environment is, the harder it is to identify and therefore combat disinformation. And even though we knew this was a factor, this case kind of helps us quantify to what extent it's a factor. And that brings us to the third conclusion, which is that long-term exposure to a single specific narrative without competing information increases individual susceptibility to information warfare. The second category of lessons concerns phenomena that haven't really been common themes in the literature so far. And we begin there with the role of counter-disinformation infrastructure. So Ukraine has significantly developed its resilience to information warfare ever since Russia first invaded in 2014, both through infrastructure and through partnerships with civil society and NGOs. And these have been extremely successful in increasing the population's resilience to disinformation and reducing the amount of support that some of these narratives have in Ukraine. And lastly, we know that disinformation narratives are more successful the closer they are to the truth. And this is really well exemplified by the Ghost of Kiev case. So at the beginning of the war, Ukraine posted a bunch of videos of a fighter jet that was shooting down 6 planes a day. It was gaining huge traction, huge international attention, although the video was actually from a video game. So this, clearly not true. However, this didn't really cause any backlash against Ukraine because it was somewhat based in truth. The Ukrainian Air Force was fighting and taking down planes, perhaps not in the videos, and perhaps, it was a bit exaggerated how many, but it was somewhat based in truth, in contrast to some of Russia's narratives about Ukraine. So moving on to the Israel-Gaza war and adopting the same idea of old versus new lessons, we'll begin with lessons that have been developed. And firstly, we have the idea that information warfare levels the playing field in asymmetric conflicts. And what that means is that success in the information domain is not predicated on technological superiority or which side has more money. So because both Israel and Hamas were able to achieve to reach massive global audiences, generate support and shift public opinion, despite having vastly different resources and capabilities available to them. In terms of new lessons, we can examine the role of ambiguity. We know it creates a strategic benefit because both sides can take advantage of the uncertainty and either claim responsibility for an operation or attempt to pin it on the other side, depending on which is more valuable at a given time. That part itself is not new. However, what we've seen in this conflict is that the biggest factor in determining who benefits from this ambiguity is public opinion. So in other words, whoever is winning the information war at a given time, so to speak, is likely to be the beneficiary of this ambiguity. And secondly, we learnt that an unsuccessful information operation is not one that fails to achieve its stated objective, but one that actively achieves the opposite end. So we can see this really well through some of Israel's international messaging. They made some various public statements that were intended to justify their operations in Gaza, actually ended up doing the opposite and generating significant amount of criticism for Israel. These operations didn't fail because they didn't impact people's opinion. They failed because they impacted opinion in the opposite direction as intended. So zooming out of these two conflicts, we can draw some further lessons through comparison. Going back to the point on proximity, we realize that this theory only holds true, firstly, where the information environment is at least somewhat open, and secondly, that it becomes less salient in longer-term conflicts that have a long-term informational component to them. Secondly, we know that the most prominent narrative is the competition for victimhood, followed by efforts to discredit adversaries. But states recognize that they can capitalize on sympathy, particularly in the wake of an attack, and mobilize this sympathy into tangible support. And this is what makes the information domain so important, because it's almost more important to be perceived as the victim of an attack than to actually be the victim of an attack. Thirdly, we know that information operations do not exist in a vacuum. Sometimes the way things are perceived simply cannot be manipulated. And this is what made Russia's international information operations so unsuccessful. No matter how much they tried to, espouse narratives that Ukrainians were neo-Nazis, people could very much easily verify this information for themselves, either by looking at official documents or by looking, at the large majority of media. And lastly, increased public awareness of disinformation has changed how the public engages with information warfare. Because it's more top of mind than it ever has been before, people are more alert. They're not necessarily more likely to identify it, but they are more likely to feel hostility rather than antipathy when they detect these information operations. So, in terms of recommendations for policy, we have to start with the facts, and that is, even though we have some studies establishing a relationship between disinformation and short-term individual belief change, there is not any research concretely establishing a causal relationship between disinformation and negative social outcomes. And this is particularly true for the long term. So if our idea is to base policy prescriptions on the idea that information warfare is harmful, we need to be able to concretely prove that first. Secondly, amendments need to be made to international humanitarian law. As it stands, disinformation is almost entirely permitted, with only a few very, very narrow exceptions. However, any limitations on the content used in information warfare would have to be subject to ongoing legal debates about the limitations of free speech, which is perhaps a bit beyond the scope of my paper. And lastly, we need to combat it in the short term with a multi-stakeholder approach. So at the platform level, this means fact-checking and account verification to make sure that all accounts are real people, thinking about kind of bot networks and AI. At the government and civil society level, this looks like infrastructural developments and programs to dismantle and counter disinformation. And at the societal level, this looks like educational and awareness campaigns, perhaps amendments to national curricula geared towards teaching people how to identify and then combat disinformation. Right.
Thanks. This has been such an eye-opening presentation for me. Information warfare is not something I'm very familiar with. And I'm just curious about something you mentioned a little bit earlier about vying to be the one that's the victim or for victimhood. From an outsider's perspective, it might seem like if you're engaged in a war, it might be to your advantage to seem in control of the situation. So I'm curious if you could elaborate a little bit more about why victimhood is so essential to winning the information warfare game.
Yeah, so that's something I saw across both case studies and across all of the actors in the case studies. And I think the reason perhaps why it's so important is we've seen this in the past as well. When a country receives a lot of popular support kind of can translate into government policy if it's enough. So there's the idea, firstly, that top-down effect on changes to opinion can perhaps influence the course of the war. And secondly, I think a large goal was to be able to directly translate sympathy into military aid, into financial support, into technical support, or any kind of contribution to the war effort. I think, that's the primary goal of the sympathy part.
Thank you. Very, very good. Very impressive. The two cases you consider, Gaza and Ukraine, are, in a way, there's symmetry in them in the sense that there's, you can argue, a superpower and a weaker, party that's not giving up. Let's put it this way. And the lessons you came up with, the new lessons, how generalizable are they to scenarios that are not these two? Like, would this apply to a case where maybe there's a bit more balance or
Yeah. So I think that's a good point in that there are a decent amount of similarities between the two cases. But the reason I selected them is because I felt that there was more difference. So I thought that kind of taking, I see how your comparison is, but the idea of two state actors versus one state actor and one non-state actor in terms of international recognition and in terms of resourcing and structure. So I thought those parallels could kind of make lessons a bit more general. I think for these specific takeaways, most of them are, I think, generally applicable. The reason actually that the first takeaway has that second comment about the impact of kind of the long-term informational component is because the proximity effect in the Israel-Gaza case study was obviously very different than it was in the Russia-Ukraine one. So, is everything directly translatable to other conflicts? Probably not. But I think by and large, the trends that I've identified do fit to most, especially if you kind of think about it from a content and a reception, or at least international reception perspective.
All right. Thank you, Jessica.
Thank you.